The whispers began the moment Lena Harper stepped into Raven's End. They slithered through the fog, coiled around her thoughts, and tugged at her soul. The town was a graveyard of secrets, its streets empty, its lighthouse a jagged scar against the stormy sky. Lena had come to document its decay, but the deeper she dug, the more she realized. Raven's End wasn't just haunted, it was hungry, and it had been waiting for her. The fog clung to Lena Harper like a thick, damp blanket as she stepped off the bus and onto the desolate streets of Raven's End. The coastal town, which appeared more a relic of forgotten history than a place still living, seemed to disappear into the mist. With every step, the distant crash of the waves against the jagged cliffs echoed through the dense air, a reminder that the town's very existence was intertwined with the restless ocean. Raven's End was one of those towns that seemed to have no place in modern life. Its buildings, mostly made of crumbling stone and wood, looked like they had been forgotten by time itself. As Lena walked past them, she felt a sense of heaviness in the air, as if the buildings were pressing down on her, the town itself holding its breath. The only sound besides the waves was the soft crunch of her boots against the wet gravel beneath her feet. The town had no real hustle or bustle, not like the vibrant cities she was used to. This place felt abandoned, like it had been forgotten by the world. She made her way to the inn, the only place for miles where she could find shelter for the night. The building loomed at the end of the street, an old, Gothic structure with a faded sign hanging loosely from its chain. The Gull's Perch, it read, but it looked more like a relic of some forgotten era than a functioning business. Lena pushed the heavy door open, and a gust of musty air greeted her. The dimly lit lobby smelled of stale wood and old books. An elderly man stood behind the counter, his face creased with years of weathered experience. His eyes, sharp yet tired, scanned her as she approached. "Evening," the man rasped, his voice gravelly. "You must be the traveler. We don't get many of those around here." Lena offered a polite smile, setting her bag down on the counter. "I'm just passing through. I've heard there's something interesting about Raven's End, so I thought I'd stay a night." The man's eyes darkened slightly, his gaze flicking toward the window, where the fog seemed to grow thicker by the second. "Interesting, you say?" He chuckled bitterly. If you want to call it that. But listen, I'd advise ye stay clear of the lighthouse. It's no place for strangers." Lena raised an eyebrow. "Why? What's wrong with the lighthouse?" The innkeeper hesitated, as if weighing the words in his mind. "Bad things happen around that place. Things best left forgotten." A chill ran down Lena's spine, but she masked it with a forced smile. "Thanks for the advice, but I'm not here for anything dangerous. Just curious, that's all." The innkeeper's eyes hardened. "Curiosity kills, miss," he muttered under his breath, before taking her payment and handing her the key to her room. "Room 3. You'll find it at the end of the hall." Lena took the key and made her way to the room, though the unease in the innkeeper's voice lingered in her mind. She had heard rumors of the town's mysterious past, but the warnings only seemed to fuel her desire to explore. She set her bag down in the small, dimly lit room, taking a moment to absorb the isolation. The walls were adorned with faded paintings of ships battling storms, and the bed was draped with thick, dusty covers. A small window looked out over the fog-covered town and the looming silhouette of the lighthouse in the distance. With a sigh, Lena pulled her camera from her bag and began snapping pictures of the room, the view outside, and the lingering fog. Her interest wasn't in the typical tourist attractions, but in capturing the eerie, decaying beauty of places untouched by time. She had always been drawn to the forgotten corners of the world, to the stories hidden within the cracks of abandoned places. Later, as the day slipped into night, Lena sat on the edge of the bed, her camera resting beside her. The fog outside thickened, and the silence became almost oppressive. It was then that she heard it. Faint at first, like the softest of whispers carried by the wind. She strained her ears, sitting up straight, but the sound seemed to come from the ocean, distant yet unmistakable. "Help me." The whisper was almost inaudible, but it echoed through her mind. It sounded like a voice, a pleading voice, calling to her. A shiver ran down her spine as she stood and moved toward the window, peering into the misty night. All she could see was the outline of the lighthouse, towering like a dark sentinel against the fog. A sudden sense of dread gripped her. She didn't know why, but something about that lighthouse felt wrong. It was as if the very air around it was charged with something ancient, something that didn't belong. Yet, her curiosity pushed her forward. She would visit the lighthouse tomorrow, no matter the warnings. That night, as she lay in bed, trying to sleep, she dreamed. It was a strange dream, filled with shifting shadows and distant voices. In the dream, she stood at the foot of the lighthouse, staring up at the crumbling stone tower. A figure stood in the doorway, their face hidden in shadow, but their presence was unmistakable. The figure raised a hand, beckoning her forward. Lena! The voice, familiar and chilling, called her name, sending a jolt of recognition and fear through her. She awoke with a start, her heart pounding. The dream felt so real, so vivid, that for a moment, she wasn't sure if she had just been asleep or if it had all been some kind of premonition. Rubbing her eyes, Lena reached for her camera. The lens flicked open as she checked the photos she had taken earlier. The pictures of the town, the lighthouse, and her room flickered on the screen, but something was wrong. There, in the background of one of the photos, was a figure, blurred and distorted, yet undeniably present. A dark silhouette standing near the lighthouse, almost as if it had been there all along, watching her. Lena's breath caught in her throat. The figure was too clear to be a mistake, too real to be a mere trick of the light. But who, or what, was it? Shaken, she scrolled through the other images. They were all the same. Blurred figures, shadowy forms lurking in the background of every shot. None of them had been there when she had taken the pictures. The whispers returned in her mind, louder now, and she felt an overwhelming pull toward the lighthouse. Something was waiting for her there, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. As the town of Ravens End lay shrouded in fog, Lena felt the weight of its secrets pressing down on her. She was no longer just a curious traveler. She was part of the town's story now, whether she liked it or not. The question was, what would it cost her to uncover the truth? The morning after Lena's unsettling discovery of the blurred figure in her camera, the fog had not lifted. If anything, it had grown thicker, more suffocating, enveloping Ravens End like a living thing. The town felt still, as though it were holding its breath, and the whispers from the night before lingered in Lena's mind. She knew she couldn't let it go. There was something dark in this place, something that beckoned her forward. Her first task was to find out more about Tom. Tom was a fisherman, a local man known to Lena only by name. He had been part of the town for as long as anyone could remember, one of the few people still working the boats that dotted the coast. But now, he was missing, his disappearance causing ripples of anxiety among the remaining residents. Lena walked to the docks early that morning, her camera slung over her shoulder, determined to learn what had happened to him. The sea air was sharp and cold, cutting through the fog like a knife. She passed by empty boats, some with nets tangled on the deck, others abandoned altogether. The smell of salt and fish clung to the air, yet there was an underlying stench of rot that made Lena's stomach turn. As she walked further down the pier, she found it, the boat. It was Tom's boat, or what was left of it. The small wooden vessel rocked gently against the dock, its hull battered and scarred, as though it had been abandoned in a hurry. The strange thing, however, was the carving. Deep, intricate symbols were etched into the wood along the side, symbols Lena couldn't recognize. They were old, as though they had been there for years, but the carving appeared freshly made. Lena squatted down to inspect the markings, her breath fogging in the cold air. Each symbol seemed deliberate, like a language or a message left behind. She traced her fingers along the grooves, and her mind raced with possibilities. Was it some sort of warning? Or was it a signal left by Tom before he vanished? "Not safe here," someone said behind her, and Lena spun around. An older man, his face weathered and hunched, stood near the edge of the dock. He looked at Lena with a mixture of fear and anger. His hands shook as he clutched a rusted fishing rod. "Don't bother looking," the man continued, his voice gravelly. "People who disappear here don't come back. Ever." Lena stood up slowly. "What do you mean? What happened to Tom?" The man glanced over his shoulder, making sure no one was watching, before taking a few steps closer. "You want the truth?" he asked in a whisper. "Ask the sea. Ask the lighthouse. But I'll tell you this, you'll get no answers from us. It's not just Tom. People vanish, like ghosts. Every 10 years, 5 people are taken. We all know it, but we don't talk about it. No one talks about it." Lena felt the weight of his words settle in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how many warnings she received. Later that day, she went to the town's library. The building was tucked away behind a small alley, its stone exterior weathered and worn. It looked as if it had been standing for centuries, yet the door was oddly modern. Wooden with a brass handle, polished and new. Inside, the scent of old paper and dust greeted her, along with the quiet hum of solitude. There were only a few patrons scattered throughout the library, their eyes fixed on yellowed pages, oblivious to the outside world. Lena approached the librarian, a woman with silver hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her sharp eyes followed Lena as she approached the desk. "I'm looking for information," Lena began, "about the town's history. Specifically, about disappearances." The librarian's face hardened at the mention of disappearances. "You won't find much," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "People here don't talk about it. Too many bad memories." Lena didn't back down. "I need to know." After a long pause, the librarian's expression softened. "You're looking in the wrong place, but if you must know, there's a journal. It's in the back, in the restricted section. It belonged to an old lighthouse keeper. His name was Walter Griggs. He lived here during the last wave of disappearances." Lena didn't wait for another word. She thanked the librarian and made her way to the restricted section. The room was dark and smelled of old wood, with rows of bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling. After a few minutes of searching, she found the journal wedged between 2 dusty volumes. It was an old leather-bound book, its cover cracked and worn. The pages inside were yellowed with age, the ink faded in places. Lena flipped through the pages, her fingers trembling as she read the cryptic entries. Walter Griggs had written in a hurried, almost desperate hand. Each entry described strange occurrences around the lighthouse. Unexplained lights, sounds that came from the sea, and whispers in the wind. One entry, dated 10 years before his death, caught her attention. "The Hollow Man has returned. The ritual must be performed, or more will disappear. The sea demands it. I fear I am too late." Lena's heart skipped a beat as she continued reading. The Hollow Man. The figure from her dreams, the one who had called her name. The journal spoke of a ritual, a dark, twisted ritual involving the ocean and the sacrifice of 5 souls to keep the Hollow Man at bay. According to Griggs, the disappearances were not random. They were part of the ritual. Every 10 years, the Hollow Man would claim 5 victims, unless the ritual was performed correctly. The lighthouse, it seemed, was the center of it all. Lena felt a growing sense of unease as she read the final entry. "Tonight is the night. I must complete the ritual, or we will all suffer." The lighthouse keeper has always been the last to fall. A sudden creak of the door behind her made her spin around, heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't alone. Lena quickly shut the journal and stood up. She felt watched, the air thick with tension. She scanned the library, but no one was there. It was only her and the books now, but something didn't feel right. As she made her way to the door, Lena felt an ice-cold draft brush past her, and then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps that echoed in the silence. She turned to see nothing but shadows. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Later that night, after a restless dinner, Lena returned to her room at the inn. The atmosphere in the town felt suffocating, and her mind was racing with what she had learned. She knew she had to confront the truth, confront the lighthouse. But when she opened her door, she froze. There, on the mirror, was a message, scrawled in thick, red letters that looked as if they had been written in blood. "Leave now." Lena's breath caught in her throat as her heart raced. It wasn't just a warning anymore. It was a threat. With trembling hands, she reached for the camera hanging from her neck. But before she could focus, the footsteps outside her door grew louder. Someone, or something, was waiting for her. The night had fallen, and Raven's End was swallowed by an eerie darkness. The fog seemed thicker than ever, clinging to the buildings like a living thing. The lighthouse stood at the edge of the cliffs, looming above the town like a sentinel. To Lena, it was no longer just a structure. It had become the heart of her investigation, the source of the disappearances, and, most importantly, the key to her sister's fate. She had to go in. Lena had spent days walking around the outskirts of the lighthouse, watching it from afar, trying to decipher the way in. The townsfolk had made it clear they were watching her every move. But she had learned their tricks, their unspoken rules, and now, she was ready to break them. As she approached the lighthouse from the dense woods at the base of the cliffs, her pulse quickened, but her resolve remained strong. She moved stealthily, avoiding the main path leading up to the lighthouse, keeping herself hidden in the shadows. The entrance was locked, but Lena had come prepared. A crowbar she had borrowed from the inn's storeroom gave her the leverage she needed to pry open the door. The hinges creaked loudly as the door swung open, but the darkness inside swallowed the sound. Inside, the lighthouse smelled old, musty, damp, as though it hadn't been touched in years. Lena flicked on her flashlight, its beam cutting through the heavy darkness. The walls were covered in layers of peeling paint, and the floor creaked beneath her feet with every step. She moved cautiously, scanning the interior, her mind racing with questions. What had happened to Tom? To the others? And why had the lighthouse keeper, Walter Griggs, left behind such cryptic clues? Her heart skipped a beat as she reached the foot of the spiral staircase that led up to the lantern room. The staircase was narrow, winding up into the darkness. She hesitated for a moment, then steeled herself. She had come too far to turn back now. But as she started to climb, she noticed something strange. The walls weren't just lined with dust and decay. There were markings, scratches, symbols etched deep into the stone. They seemed to form a pattern, spiraling upward, as though someone, or something, had been carving them for years. Lena's mind raced as she traced her fingers along the carvings. It was the same pattern she had seen on Tom's boat, the strange symbols. What did they mean? At the top of the stairs, Lena found the door to the lantern room. She pushed it open slowly, and the room was just as she had imagined. Empty, save for the large glass lantern at the center. The light had long since gone out, and the room was cold, as though it had been abandoned for ages. But it wasn't empty. Lena's eyes immediately fell on the wall opposite the lantern. There, hidden behind a stack of old crates, was a door. Small, almost hidden from view, as though it had been deliberately concealed. Her heart pounded as she approached it, her breath coming out in short gasps. She didn't know what she was expecting, but it wasn't this. Lena forced the door open, and her flashlight illuminated a small, cramped room. The air was thick with dust, and the shelves were lined with old trinkets, keepsakes, mementos. But what caught her attention was the wall. It was covered in photographs, yellowed with age, tacked up like a twisted collage. Lena's heart stopped as she stepped closer. There, among the pictures of missing townsfolk, was a photograph of her sister, Sarah. The photo was old, but unmistakable. Sarah, smiling, carefree, standing near the cliffs, her hand resting lightly on the shoulder of an unfamiliar man. The man was blurry, his face obscured, but Lena knew, deep down, that he was the one in the town's whispered tales, the Hollow Man. Lena reached out, trembling, and pulled the photograph from the wall. There were others around it, photographs of people she didn't recognize. They all had one thing in common. They were missing. A sense of dread filled her as she studied the room. It wasn't just a collection of memories. It was a shrine, an altar, with offerings to the ocean. A small table in the center was covered in objects, pieces of jewelry, trinkets, even a child's toy. Items that had clearly been left by those who had disappeared. Lena felt a chill run down her spine as she realized what this was. This was where the ritual had taken place. She backed away slowly, her mind racing with the implications. The lighthouse keeper's journal had spoken of this. The ritual that had to be performed to appease the Hollow Man Lena's sister had been taken, and now, she understood why. The Hollow Man didn't just take anyone. He took those who were meant to be offerings. Suddenly, a sound from behind her broke the silence. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing off the walls. Lena's breath hitched. She spun around, her flashlight shaking in her hand. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its face was hidden in shadow. The Hollow Man. He was real. Lena froze, paralyzed with fear, as the figure stepped forward, his movements unnatural, as though he was gliding rather than walking. The air grew colder, the very temperature of the room dropping. The shadows seemed to deepen around him, engulfing the light from Lena's flashlight. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once, the Hollow Man spoke. Lena. Her name echoed in the darkness. Lena's heart raced, her body screaming at her to run. But her legs refused to move, her mind overwhelmed by the terror of the moment. She had no choice. She turned and fled. She ran through the cramped halls, down the narrow staircase, her feet stumbling on the uneven steps. The Hollow Man's footsteps followed her, each one growing louder, closer. Lena could hear his breath, raspy, as though it were too much for him to take in. She dared not look back. The lighthouse seemed to stretch on forever, its labyrinthine halls and narrow passages confounding her every step. She reached the bottom of the stairs, her lungs burning, her heart hammering in her chest. The door was in sight, but before she could reach it, the Hollow Man was there. His hand, cold, like ice, grabbed her shoulder, spinning her around. "Sarah," the Hollow Man whispered. Lena gasped, her body trembling uncontrollably. He knew about Sarah. How? How could he know? With every ounce of strength she had, Lena wrenched herself free from his grip and sprinted out the door. The cold night air hit her like a slap, and she didn't stop running. Not until she was far enough from the lighthouse that she could no longer hear his footsteps. As she stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath, Lena's mind reeled. She had learned enough. The Hollow Man was real, and he had claimed her sister. But the battle was far from over. Lena had only just begun to understand the depths of the curse that bound Raven's End, and now she was determined to destroy it. She would burn the lighthouse down, and everything it stood for. The days that followed the encounter in the lighthouse were a blur for Lena. She had returned to the inn, but the walls seemed to close in around her. Every creak of the old floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, made her jump. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something far deeper, more insidious. The Hollow Man had invaded her thoughts. His presence lingered even when he wasn't there, like a shadow she could never escape. It wasn't enough for him to simply haunt the lighthouse. Now, he was following her, slipping into the corners of her mind, warping her reality. Lena knew she couldn't trust herself anymore. It started subtly. Her reflection in the inn's old mirror seemed off, distorted in ways she couldn't explain. At first, it was just a trick of the light. Then, the whispering began again. It wasn't as clear as before, but she could feel it. A voice just beneath the surface, always present, always watching. And then, the photographs. Lena had always been meticulous with her camera, always certain of the shots she took. But now, she'd pick up her camera to find photos she didn't remember taking. Pictures of herself, sometimes in places she hadn't been, other times of the lighthouse, even though she hadn't returned there. In every image, the Hollow Man lurked in the background, his face still hidden, but his presence unmistakable. It was as if he was playing a game with her, forcing her to confront him in ways that made her question her sanity. One night, after discovering yet another photo of herself standing on the cliffs, Lena felt the urge to talk to someone. She needed answers, something to ground her, to make sense of the madness that was swallowing her whole. That was when she decided to visit the town's historian, a reclusive man named Arthur Doyle. He lived on the outskirts of Raven's End, in a crumbling cottage that looked as though it had been abandoned for decades. Arthur welcomed her inside, his ancient eyes scanning her face with a knowing look. He didn't ask any questions, but Lena could see the weight of history in his gaze. He had seen it all before. "I know what you're after," he said, his voice low, gravelly. "You want to understand the curse. But be warned, it's not something you should take lightly." Lena sat down, her heart pounding. The Hollow Man. Who is he? Why is he doing this? Arthur's eyes darkened, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for an old, leather-bound book on the shelf. He flipped it open, his fingers tracing the pages as he spoke. The Hollow Man is not a ghost, not a mere spirit. He is something far older, a being born from the depths of the sea, a creature that thrives on the souls of the living. Raven's End was founded on a blood pact, a promise made to the ocean to keep it appeased. The Hollow Man is the price of that pact. Every 10 years, 5 souls are taken to honor the agreement. Your sister. She was one of the chosen. Lena's throat tightened. But why me? Why is he after me now? Arthur sighed, his eyes clouded with sorrow. Because you're the one who can break the curse. You're the descendant of the one who made the pact, the one who sealed Raven's End's fate. The Hollow Man has come for you. But he won't take you until you confront him, face him in his lair during the storm. Only then will the curse be broken. The storm. Lena's mind raced. The storm had always been part of the legend, part of the ritual, but she hadn't understood its significance until now. Arthur continued. The storm is when the Hollow Man is most powerful, when the ocean calls for its tribute. If you can face him during the storm, you might be able to destroy him, to break the pact. Lena felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. And if I don't? Arthur didn't answer directly. Instead, he closed the book with a slow, deliberate motion and met her gaze. Then Raven's End will sink beneath the waves, and everyone in it will be lost. Understood. Lena spent the next few days preparing. She knew what she had to do. The storm was coming, the winds already picking up, the skies darkening with every passing hour. There was no time to waste. The Hollow Man's torment was becoming unbearable. Every time she closed her eyes, he was there, standing just beyond her sight. His voice whispered her name, sending chills down her spine. His presence was suffocating, as though the very air was thick with his essence. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't think straight. Her nerves were frayed, her resolve weakening with each passing minute. The storm was getting closer. The townsfolk spoke of it in hushed tones, as though they knew what was coming. The ocean was angry, the waves crashing against the cliffs in a roar that drowned out all other sound. It felt as though the world itself was holding its breath. Lena knew she had no choice. That night, as the first drops of rain began to fall, Lena made her way back to the lighthouse. The wind howled through the trees, pushing her forward, urging her to go. She couldn't explain it, but something deep within her told her this was the moment. This was her chance. When she arrived, the lighthouse loomed before her, its silhouette a dark, foreboding shape against the stormy sky. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the swirling fog that surrounded the structure. Lena's heart beat in her chest, each thud echoing in her ears. She stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached for the door. The storm was coming. The Hollow Man was waiting, and Lena was ready. The storm had reached its peak by the time Lena made her way to the lighthouse. The wind screamed in her ears, battering her face with sheets of rain. Every step felt like a struggle, the ground slick beneath her boots, the air charged with the fury of the ocean. The Hollow Man had already made it clear he wasn't going to make this easy. If she was to break the curse, this was the only way. She couldn't afford hesitation now. With the storm howling and the darkness closing in around her, Lena felt a resolve take hold. Stronger than fear, stronger than doubt. She had come here to face the Hollow Man, and she would not leave until she had done so. The lighthouse loomed before her like a monolith, dark and ominous. The light that once guided sailors long extinguished. Lightning flashed, illuminating the twisted form of the building, the stone walls groaning in protest under the pressure of the storm. Lena's heart raced in her chest, but she pressed on, her mind focused on the task at hand. When she reached the entrance, she paused for a moment, gathering her courage. She knew that what she faced was no ordinary battle. The Hollow Man was not just a creature of flesh and bone. He was a manifestation of Raven's End's darkest history, a force born from the ocean's depths and bound to the town by an ancient curse. To defeat him, she would need more than just bravery. She would need the knowledge she had gathered, the strength of will to break the cycle, and a little bit of luck. Lena pushed open the door, the hinges creaking in protest. She stepped inside, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The interior of the lighthouse was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of salt and decay. The faint glow of lightning outside illuminated the eerie silence, but she knew she was not alone. The Hollow Man was there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting for her. It wasn't long before she heard him. The familiar, haunting sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, almost predatory. Her pulse quickened. She could feel his presence even though she couldn't see him. It was as if the very walls of the lighthouse were alive, breathing with his malevolent energy. Then, from the darkness, he appeared. The Hollow Man. His face was obscured, as always, by the swirling shadows that clung to him like a shroud. His tall, gaunt form loomed over her, his eyes empty voids that seemed to swallow all light. There was no sound except for the crashing of the waves against the cliffs, the storm's fury mirrored in the malevolent figure before her. "You've come to end it," his voice rasped, a low, guttural whisper that sent shivers down Lena's spine. "But you cannot stop what is already in motion. The curse has claimed this town for centuries. It will claim you too." Lena took a step forward, her fists clenched. "No, I've come to destroy you. This ends tonight." The Hollow Man's lips curled into a grin, his face distorting in the shifting shadows. "We shall see." Before she could react, he lunged at her, his movement swift and unnatural. Lena barely managed to dodge, the force of his attack sending her crashing into the stone wall. The impact rattled her bones, but she forced herself back to her feet, her mind racing. She had to be faster. She had to use what she knew about the curse. Lena's thoughts flashed to the journal Arthur had shown her. The ritual, the pact, the lighthouse. It was all tied together, and the key to breaking the curse lay in the very heart of the building. The Hollow Man lunged again, but this time Lena was ready. She ducked beneath his outstretched arm, her body moving on instinct. She grabbed the nearby lantern and swung it at him, the glass shattering against his chest. For a moment, the Hollow Man staggered back, his form flickering like a flame in the wind. Lena took her chance. She rushed toward the center of the lighthouse, where the altar stood. It was time to destroy the source of his power. She reached into her bag and pulled out the small vial of salt she had been carrying, the one Arthur had given her. Salt was known to break curses, to disrupt the flow of dark magic. She threw it onto the altar, watching as it sizzled and burned the stone. The Hollow Man roared in fury, his form becoming more erratic, shifting like smoke. "You cannot win," he bellowed, his voice echoing in every corner of the lighthouse. Lena wasn't done yet. She reached for the old, rusted lever next to the altar, the mechanism that controlled the lighthouse's light. With a forceful pull, she activated it, and the great lens above began to turn. Light burst from the lens, illuminating the Hollow Man in a blinding flash. He screamed, the shadows around him writhing as if in agony. Lena kept her eyes focused on the Hollow Man as she backed toward the window. The storm outside had reached its peak, the wind howling louder than ever, the waves crashing violently against the rocks. She knew that this was the moment. The curse had to be broken. With every ounce of strength she had left, Lena pushed the lever to its breaking point. The light grew brighter, the lighthouse shaking with the force of the storm. And then, in one final, deafening roar, the Hollow Man dissipated into the light, his form shattering like glass, leaving only the faintest echoes of his presence behind. The lighthouse began to collapse. Lena turned and ran, her feet pounding against the floor as the stone walls cracked and split. She reached the door just as the building shook, the very foundation of the lighthouse giving way beneath her. With a final surge of strength, she pushed open the door and staggered out into the storm. The wind howled around her, but for the first time since she arrived in Raven's End, the whispers stopped. Lena collapsed on the cliffs, her body shaking with exhaustion, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The storm was beginning to calm, the winds dying down as the waves settled. But even as the storm subsided, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She glanced back at the lighthouse, its silhouette now nothing more than rubble, the sea slowly claiming the wreckage. She stood, wiping the rain from her face, and turned to leave Raven's End behind her. But as she walked away, she felt the cold chill of the ocean breeze against her skin. And deep in the distance, in the dark recesses of her mind, the whispers returned, faint but unmistakable. "Leave now," they seemed to say. Lena had hoped that leaving Raven's End behind her would bring peace, but the nightmares followed her across the miles. It wasn't just the memories of the Hollow Man, or the twisted visions of the lighthouse. It was the whispers, soft, barely audible, like a distant murmur carried by the wind. They never stopped. She couldn't escape them, no matter how hard she tried. It had been 2 weeks since she left the storm-ravaged town, 2 weeks since she destroyed the lighthouse. Lena had returned to her apartment in the city, hoping the familiar comfort of her home would offer some respite. But nothing felt the same. The apartment that once felt like her sanctuary now felt suffocating, the air thick with unease. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, set her nerves on edge. She had become hypersensitive to every sound, every shadow, every movement. Her camera, once a tool of exploration, now felt like a weight around her neck. It sat on the shelf, staring at her, a reminder of everything she had endured. Every time she picked it up, she could almost feel the Hollow Man's presence lurking behind her, waiting for her to look into the lens again. The photographs that once captured moments of beauty now seemed like distorted echoes of the past. Lena had tried to go back to her normal routine. Her work, her interactions with friends, even simple tasks like cooking or grocery shopping. But everything felt hollow. Every conversation was a blur, and she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her. She had no peace. It wasn't long before the hallucinations began. At first, they were fleeting. A glimpse of a shadow in the corner of her vision, the feeling of being followed, the sound of footsteps behind her that disappeared when she turned around. She tried to brush it off, blaming stress and the trauma of what she had gone through. But it wasn't stress. It was something else, something darker. One evening, as Lena sat on the couch, going through old photographs on her laptop, her heart skipped a beat. She had uploaded the pictures from her trip to Raven's End, photos of the lighthouse, the cliffs, the town, and was sorting through them, looking for a way to piece together the story she hoped to write. But there, among the images, was something that shouldn't have been. A blurred figure, standing at the edge of the lighthouse, almost imperceptible in the background. The Hollow Man. Lena's fingers froze over the keyboard. She scrolled through the other photos, her eyes wide with disbelief. There, in each one, in every frame she had taken that night, there he was again. A shadowy, indistinct form lurking just out of focus, haunting the edges of every image. The chilling reality sank in. The Hollow Man had followed her home. Her heart raced, panic clawing at her chest. She slammed the laptop shut, but it didn't stop the cold from creeping over her. The whispers returned, louder now, a soft voice weaving through the very air. "You cannot escape." Lena's hands shook as she reached for the phone, her mind reeling. She dialed the number of Arthur, the local historian who had shared so much with her about Raven's End, but there was no answer. She left a voicemail, her voice tight with fear, begging him for any insight, any way to rid herself of the curse. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. She had destroyed the lighthouse, but the Hollow Man was not tied to the physical place. He was tied to her. He was part of her now, a dark shadow she couldn't outrun. As the days went by, the occurrences grew worse. She woke up to find her room colder than it should be, her breath visible in the air despite the heat in the apartment. The whispers grew clearer, calling her name, urging her to return. In the middle of the night, she would hear the sound of footsteps in the hallway, but when she checked, the apartment was empty. It was as though the curse had come with her, its grip tightening, suffocating her. Then, one afternoon, a package arrived. It was small, unmarked, and there was no return address. Lena felt a shiver run down her spine as she held it in her hands. Her name was written on the front in neat, block letters, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. She tore open the package, and as she did, a chill washed over her, as if the very air had turned cold. Inside was a small velvet pouch, the kind that held something precious. When she opened it, she gasped. There, nestled inside, was her sister's necklace, the one she had worn all those years ago, before she disappeared. Lena's breath hitched. She hadn't seen that necklace in years, not since the day her sister had gone missing. She had assumed it was lost, forgotten. But now, here it was, in her hands again. But that wasn't all. There was a note, folded neatly inside the pouch. Lena unfolded the paper, her hands trembling. The message was simple, but the words sent ice through her veins. You can't escape the hollowing. The room seemed to close in around her as the weight of the note settled in her mind. She had been wrong. The curse hadn't ended with the destruction of the lighthouse. It had only begun. The Hollow Man's reach extended far beyond Raven's End, far beyond the town or the lighthouse. He had chosen her, and there was no escape from the hollowing. Lena dropped the note, her pulse pounding in her ears. The whispers, soft and persistent, grew louder in her mind, and she knew with sickening certainty that the Hollow Man was waiting for her to return. Lena's world had become a blur of shadows and whispers. The normalcy she once knew seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the haunting presence of the Hollow Man. No matter how hard she tried to return to a life of peace, the curse followed her, tightening its grip on her every waking moment. She had tried to ignore it at first. The whispers were faint, barely noticeable, like the hum of an old radio. She thought maybe it was her mind playing tricks on her, that the trauma of Raven's End had left her with scars she wasn't ready to face. But as days passed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, more real. They were there when she woke, when she walked down the street, when she sat alone in her apartment. They were always there, just out of sight, urging her to listen. Lena tried to continue with her life. She went to work, met with friends, forced herself to leave the apartment to go grocery shopping, but everything felt off. The bustling streets, the crowded cafes, the quiet evenings at home. All of it was tainted by a constant undercurrent of dread. It was as though the very fabric of the world had unraveled, revealing the presence of something sinister beneath the surface. The photographs were the worst part. She had tried to stop taking pictures, but it was impossible. The camera had become an extension of herself, a tool to try to understand the strange world she found herself in. But now, every time she clicked the shutter, the images that developed on the screen were tainted by the Hollow Man. At first, it was subtle, a shadow in the corner of the frame, a figure out of focus in the background. But as the days went on, the presence of the Hollow Man became impossible to ignore. He was there, in every photo, lurking just out of sight, his face a blur of darkness. He had followed her home. Lena's obsession with the camera grew. She couldn't explain it, but she felt as though the photos were the key to understanding the curse. Maybe the Hollow Man had some connection to them, some hidden message waiting to be uncovered. Each image seemed to tell a different story, a story that twisted and turned, refusing to reveal its true meaning. Lena spent hours in front of the screen, analyzing each picture, looking for patterns, trying to decipher what the Hollow Man was trying to tell her. The more she looked, the more she saw him. It wasn't just in the photos. The Hollow Man had become a presence in her life, a figure that loomed over her every thought, every action. Lena had never felt so watched, so exposed. It was as though he was in the room with her, standing just behind her, breathing down her neck. His shadow cast itself on the walls, in the mirror, in the windows. She could feel him everywhere. Desperate for answers, Lena turned to the only resource she hadn't yet explored: ancient rituals. She had heard of them during her time in Raven's End, mentioned in passing by the historian Arthur, but they hadn't seemed important then. Now, she realized they might be her only hope. In the quiet of her apartment, Lena poured herself into her research. She scoured old books, articles, and online forums, searching for any hint of a ritual that could sever the bond between herself and the hollow man. Hours bled into days as she sifted through pages filled with obscure symbols, ancient languages, and arcane practices. She came across mentions of curses tied to figures like the Hollow Man, spirits bound to the living through dark rituals, haunting those who crossed their paths. The deeper Lena dug, the more she realized the curse was older than she had imagined. It wasn't just tied to Raven's End, or even to the lighthouse. It was ancient, a curse that had been passed down through generations. The Hollow Man had been a figure of fear for centuries, his presence linked to the sea, to storms, to death itself. One night, as Lena read through the pages of an old, leather-bound book, she stumbled upon something that made her heart race. It was a ritual, a way to break the curse, to sever the connection between the living and the Hollow Man. The ritual involved a sacrifice of sorts, a binding of the soul, and a final confrontation during the darkest hour of the night. But the details were unclear. The book was incomplete, and the more Lena read, the more she realized that the ritual was far from foolproof. There were risks involved, and the Hollow Man was known to be a master of deception. If she failed, the consequences would be unimaginable. But it was the only chance she had. Lena's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden sound, the soft scrape of something moving in the darkness. She froze, her heart pounding. The whispers had started again, echoing through the apartment. It was then that she noticed something strange. One of the photos she had taken in Raven's End, an image of the cliffs near the lighthouse, had shifted. The figure in the background, which had once been a shadowy blur, was now clearer. And as Lena stared at the photograph, she realized the figure was not just the Hollow Man. It was Emily, her sister, standing at the edge of the cliffs, her face twisted in a silent scream. Lena's breath caught in her throat. Her sister had been connected to the curse all along, she realized. Emily's disappearance was no accident. She had been chosen. The Hollow Man had taken her, just as he had taken others before her, just as he was now taking Lena. In that moment, Lena understood the truth. The curse wasn't just about the Hollow Man. It was about the souls he claimed, the lives he consumed, and the price they had to pay for freedom. But there was still hope. Lena stood up, trembling but resolute. There was something in the back of her mind, a distant memory that nagged at her. She had seen a letter from Emily, hidden among the old belongings in her sister's room. It had been tucked away in a box, forgotten and unopened. Lena raced to her sister's old room, her heart thundering in her chest. She pulled open the drawer and found the letter, its edges frayed with time. She tore it open, her hands shaking as she read the words Emily had left behind. The letter was short, but its meaning was clear. If you're reading this, Lena, then I've failed. The Hollow Man came for me. I didn't escape, but there is a way. You must find the heart of the curse. Follow the path we walked, and you may yet break it. I love you. The words were a cryptic clue, but they gave Lena hope. There was still a way to end the curse. The heart of the Hollow Man's power, his origin, was the key. She had to go back to Raven's End, back to where it all began. The Hollow Man was waiting, but this time, Lena was ready. Lena's return to Raven's End was not a triumphant one, nor was it filled with the relief she had hoped for. The town, still shrouded in fog, appeared even more decayed than before. Buildings that had once stood proudly now sagged under the weight of time. Their windows cracked, their roofs caving in. The silence was oppressive, thick, as though the town itself had given up on the world. There was no sense of life here, only death, an echo of the past that lingered in every corner, in every creaking door and withering tree. The locals, if you could call them that, were no more welcoming than they had been on her first visit. This time, however, they didn't pretend. They didn't greet her with the usual forced smiles or quiet murmurs. They glared at her, their eyes full of suspicion and something darker. Fear, perhaps. The air between them was thick with unspoken warnings. Warnings that Lena didn't need to hear out loud to understand. They knew who she was. They knew what she was doing here. She had come back to break the curse, and they were not happy about it. Lena tried to ignore them, walking quickly through the narrow streets, her footsteps echoing against the cracked pavement. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of salt and decay. As she passed the town's dilapidated shops, she caught glimpses of the faces watching her from behind the curtains. There was no mistaking their hostility, but Lena had made her decision. She would not be deterred. Her first stop was the old inn, the same one she had stayed in during her first visit. The innkeeper was gone, replaced by a grizzled, older man who didn't even acknowledge her presence when she entered. He went about his business, cleaning the counter and muttering to himself. Lena didn't care about him. She had come for answers, and there was only one person who could provide them, Elias. She found him at the library, just as she had before, hunched over a pile of dusty books. His glasses sat low on his nose, and his fingers moved with practiced precision as he flipped through pages of ancient texts. He didn't look up when she entered, but Lena didn't need to speak. He knew she was there. "You came back," Elias said, his voice low and resigned, as if he had expected this moment. "I should have known you would." Lena nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I'm not leaving until I end it," she said, her voice steady but determined. Elias sighed and set the book aside. "You've heard the whispers, haven't you? The Hollow Man is never far behind. I'm afraid the curse doesn't let go so easily. It's tied to the very fabric of this place, to the ocean and the land. You can't break it without understanding its origins." Lena's eyes narrowed. "Tell me everything." Elias hesitated before speaking, as though he was weighing his words carefully. "The Hollow Man is not a simple spirit or a ghost. He is a manifestation of the ocean's power, a force of nature that feeds on the living. The town's history is tied to the sea, its prosperity, its downfall, and its curse. The ocean is both the source of life and the agent of death here. The Hollow Man is its servant, a figure created to ensure the town never forgets the price of its survival." Lena absorbed his words, her mind racing. "So the curse, the Hollow Man, it's all tied to the ocean?" "Yes," Elias replied. "The ocean is the lifeblood of Raven's End, but it is also its executioner. The people here made a pact with the sea long ago, sacrifices to keep the town thriving, to protect it from the storms. But the Hollow Man's power is not without limits. Over time, he grew restless, and the sacrifices became more frequent, more brutal. People began to disappear, 5 every 10 years. No one ever questioned it, not until you arrived." Lena clenched her fists, a deep sense of dread settling in her stomach. "But how do I stop it?" Elias looked away, as though the question was too difficult to answer. "There is a place beneath the cliffs, a hidden cave where the ocean's power is strongest. It is the heart of the curse, the source of the Hollow Man's strength. If you destroy what lies there, you may break the curse. But be warned, Lena, the Hollow Man will not let you reach it without a fight." A chill ran through Lena's body as Elias's words settled in her mind. She had come to Raven's End for answers, but now she had more questions. The Hollow Man had always seemed like a shadow, a creature of the night, but his connection to the ocean, that was something entirely new. The idea of a cave beneath the cliffs, a place where the ocean's power was concentrated, made her heart race with both fear and excitement. Elias rose from his chair, his face grim. "Go then, but be careful. The town may try to stop you, but the Hollow Man will be the least of your worries." Lena nodded, steeling herself for what lay ahead. She had no time to waste. She knew the journey would be dangerous, and the Hollow Man would be watching her every step. But for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone. She had the knowledge she needed to end this, to break the curse once and for all. Lena made her way to the cliffs, her heart pounding in her chest. The wind whipped around her, and the salty tang of the ocean filled her lungs. The waves crashed against the rocks below, their relentless rhythm matching the pounding of her heart. She had seen this place before. The cliffs, the jagged edges, the endless horizon. But this time, it was different. This time, she was here for a purpose. As she reached the edge of the cliffs, Lena's eyes scanned the rocks, looking for any sign of the hidden cave Elias had mentioned. She had no idea where it was, but she trusted her instincts. She knew it was close. And then, she saw it. An opening, hidden in the shadows, almost as if the earth itself had swallowed it whole. Lena took a deep breath and stepped toward the cave. Her heart raced, her breath shallow. She knew that the hollow man was close. She could feel his presence, like a cold hand on the back of her neck, but she didn't hesitate. She entered the cave, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The air inside was thick with the scent of salt and decay, and the walls seemed to pulse with a strange energy. As she ventured deeper, Lena could feel the power of the ocean, ancient and untamed, vibrating through the rocks. It was here. This was where the curse had been born, where the hollow man's power was strongest. And then, just as Lena thought she might be able to push forward, she heard it. A voice, low and menacing, whispering from the darkness. "You cannot escape, Lena." It was him, the hollow man. Lena spun around, her heart in her throat. She wasn't alone. And this time, there would be no escape. The cave was a place of primal darkness, its walls slick with the dampness of the sea, the air thick with an ancient, salty mist. As Lena ventured deeper into the cave, her footsteps barely making a sound on the uneven ground, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her. The very stones beneath her feet seemed to breathe, their surfaces smooth yet jagged, as if the cave had been shaped not just by the passage of time, but by a sentient hand, a hand that had watched the town of Raven's End for centuries. Lena's breath quickened as she moved through the narrow passageways, the eerie silence only broken by the occasional distant crash of waves from the cliffs above. It was then that she saw them, carvings. They were etched into the stone, ancient and cryptic, a series of symbols that seemed to shift and change as she looked at them. Some were simple lines, others intricate patterns, all connected in a web that seemed to hum with energy. She ran her fingers over the carvings, her mind racing to decipher their meaning. It was clear that these were not just random markings. They were messages, symbols meant to convey a deeper truth. The more Lena studied them, the more she began to understand the nature of the force that had haunted this town. The hollow man's puppet master, the ocean. It wasn't just a body of water. It wasn't just a backdrop for the town's existence. The ocean was alive, a sentient force that had existed long before Raven's End had been founded. It was a creature of darkness, of unknowable power, and it used the hollow man as its agent, sending him forth to collect sacrifices and feed its insatiable hunger. The town, with its people and its history, was nothing more than a vessel for the ocean's will. The hollow man was just one of its many forms, one of its many faces. Lena's pulse quickened as she pieced together the implications of what she had discovered. The hollow man, the disappearances, the curse. It was all part of the ocean's plan. And there was only one way to stop it. But stopping it would not be easy. To confront the ocean itself was to challenge an entity beyond human understanding. As Lena moved further into the cave, her eyes fell upon something even more disturbing, a set of artifacts. They were arranged on a stone altar, coated in centuries of dust and cobwebs, but they pulsed with a faint, eerie glow. Among the items were old bones, weathered and twisted, and what appeared to be offerings to the ocean. Pieces of jewelry, faded photographs, and tattered garments, all bound by an invisible thread to the forces that had shaped the town's fate. At the center of the altar, however, was a large stone, unlike anything Lena had ever seen before. It was smooth, black, and shimmered with an otherworldly light. It seemed to hum with a quiet, rhythmic pulse, as though it were alive. Lena felt a sudden compulsion to approach it. As her fingers brushed against the stone, a sharp chill ran through her, and the air around her seemed to thicken, almost as if the cave itself were alive. In that moment, Lena understood. The ocean's power, the force behind the curse, was not just tied to the hollow man. It was tied to this place, to this very stone. This was the heart of the curse, the source of everything, the ocean's consciousness, its will. The hollow man had only been a servant, a tool to do the ocean's bidding. Lena knew what she had to do. To break the curse, she needed to communicate with the ocean itself. But she also knew that doing so would not come without consequences. The ocean would not relinquish its hold easily. She closed her eyes, steadying her breath, and began to chant the words she had found in the ancient journal. a series of phrases that were old beyond measure, written in a language no longer spoken by any living person. The words slipped from her tongue like a forgotten prayer, and as she spoke, the cave seemed to come alive around her. The air grew colder, the hum of the stone grew louder, and Lena felt as though the very earth beneath her was shifting. And then, as she reached the final words of the incantation, the cave trembled violently. The stone at the center of the altar cracked open, revealing an abyss within. A swirling vortex of water and shadow, the ocean's power manifesting before her eyes. The force was overwhelming, a presence that pressed against her mind, filling her thoughts with images of the past. Visions of Raven's End, of its people, and of the Hollow Man's creation. The vision was clear. The Hollow Man had once been a man, a lighthouse keeper who had made a pact with the ocean. Desperate to save his town from the storms that ravaged it, he had offered his soul to the sea in exchange for the safety of his people. The ocean had accepted his sacrifice, but it had not been content with just one soul. It had taken many more, 5 every decade, a price that had grown heavier with each passing year. Lena's heart raced as the vision shifted. She saw the Hollow Man, not as a shadowy figure, but as a twisted, broken man. His form contorted, his face hollow and empty, his body a vessel for the ocean's wrath. He had become its servant, its pawn, its weapon. And the people of Raven's End? They had paid the price for their town's survival. But now, Lena was part of the vision. The ocean had claimed her too. In that moment, she understood the true depth of the curse. The ocean was not just a malevolent force. It was a living entity, a god that could not be defeated by mortal means. It was a force that demanded sacrifice, that fed on fear, on pain, on loss. And Lena had become its latest offering. With a scream, Lena broke free from the vision, stumbling backward as the cave began to collapse around her. The walls cracked and groaned, the very earth shaking as if the ocean was enraged by her presence, by her attempt to break its hold. The Hollow Man's voice echoed in her ears, his words now clear. "You cannot escape, Lena. You are mine." As Lena turned to flee, she could feel the weight of the curse bearing down on her. She had reached out to the ocean, and now it had claimed her. She had hoped to communicate with it, to end the curse, but instead, she had only sealed her fate. The ocean's will was unstoppable. The Hollow Man was not just a servant. He was its herald, its messenger, and the true master was the sea itself. And Lena had just made the most terrible mistake of her life. Lena staggered back from the altar, her heart pounding as the cave around her seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The walls shimmered, shifting with the echo of the ocean's power, and for a moment, she was unsure whether she was still standing in the cave, or whether she had been pulled into something far more dangerous. The vortex she had opened with the ritual was not merely a channel for the ocean's power. It was a gateway to the past. The world around her blurred, and in an instant, Lena was no longer in the cave. She was in a small, humble house by the sea, the windows shrouded in heavy curtains, the air thick with the salt of the ocean. She could hear the crash of waves, a constant reminder of the dark force that loomed just beyond the horizon. The room was dimly lit, but there was a warmth to it, a warmth that contrasted sharply with the growing sense of dread that filled her chest. Lena could see him then, Samuel Graves, the man who would become the Hollow Man. He was young, perhaps in his early 30s, with a weathered face and eyes that carried the weight of a life lived in the shadow of the sea. He sat at a table, his hands trembling as he wrote, a letter in front of him, the words etched with desperation. The vision deepened, and Lena saw the town as it once had been, alive, vibrant, but constantly threatened by the unforgiving ocean. Samuel was a lighthouse keeper, entrusted with the safety of Raven's End and its people. His duty was to keep the light burning, to warn ships of the treacherous waters below, to guide them safely to shore. But the storms were unrelenting. Each year, the ocean grew angrier, claiming more lives with each passing storm. Lena could feel Samuel's grief, his sense of helplessness as he watched the people of the town perish one by one, his light unable to hold back the wrath of the sea. The weight of responsibility pressed on him until he could barely breathe, and he became desperate. He sought answers, sought any way to save the town he loved, and in his desperation, he made the ultimate mistake. The vision shifted again. Lena found herself standing on the cliffs, overlooking the ocean. Samuel stood beside her, staring out at the waves that crashed against the rocks below, their rhythm hypnotic, almost soothing. But there was nothing comforting about the ocean now. It was a vast, unknowable entity, its depths teeming with ancient power. In the vision, Samuel spoke, his voice trembling. "I've tried everything. I've sacrificed everything. But it's never enough. The sea, it's too powerful. It demands more." His words hung heavy in the air, and Lena felt the torment that plagued him. He was broken, a man on the edge, and he was about to make a choice that would seal his fate forever. Without warning, the ocean answered him. It rose up from the depths in a violent surge, as though it had been waiting for him, listening for his cry. Samuel stepped forward, drawn to the water like a moth to a flame, and in his desperation, he made a pact with the ocean. "I'll do anything," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Anything to stop the storms, to save them. Just tell me what I need to do." The ocean's voice echoed in his mind, a whisper as old as the world itself, a call from the depths that would never be silenced. "Sacrifice," it whispered. "You must give yourself to me. Your soul, your life. Serve me, and I will end the storms. I will save the town." The vision twisted again, this time showing Samuel standing before a dark, looming figure, the Hollow Man. The transformation was slow, agonizing. Samuel's body contorted, his mind fractured, as the ocean's power twisted him into something other than human. He became a servant of the sea, a vessel for its will. The storms ceased, the waves calmed, but at the cost of his soul. Lena watched in horror as Samuel's final moments of humanity slipped away. His face contorted in pain, his once clear eyes becoming hollow, his body warped into the grotesque figure she had seen in her nightmares. The Hollow Man was born in that moment, a man broken by grief and desperation, turned into an agent of the ocean's will. The vision flickered, and Lena felt a deep sorrow for him. Samuel Graves had not chosen to become the Hollow Man. He had not sought out the curse. It had been thrust upon him by a force greater than he could ever understand. The ocean had taken him, used him, and cast him aside, leaving him to torment the town for eternity. But now Lena saw the truth. The Hollow Man was not just a monster. He was a victim, just as much a prisoner of the ocean as the people of Raven's End had been. His torment, his madness, his twisted form. They were all the result of the ocean's cruelty, the price of his pact. Lena's heart ached for him. She had thought of him as a monster, a faceless horror that lurked in the shadows, but now she understood. Samuel Graves had been a man of duty, a man who had been broken by the very thing he had sworn to protect. The Hollow Man was the ocean's weapon, but he was not beyond redemption. Lena's resolve hardened. If she could find a way to sever the ocean's hold on Samuel, perhaps she could free him from the curse that bound him. Perhaps she could save him, just as she had hoped to save the town. The Hollow Man may have been a monster, but beneath that monstrous exterior, there was a man who had suffered beyond measure. And Lena would stop at nothing to free him. Lena stood at the edge of the cliff, staring out at the roiling ocean below. The wind howled around her, carrying with it the salt of the sea and a palpable sense of impending doom. It had been days since she had uncovered the truth about Samuel Graves, and in that time, she had not wavered in her resolve. She knew what she had to do. There was no other choice. The Hollow Man's torment was tied to the ocean, and if she wanted to free him, she would need to confront that very power. But to confront it, she needed to bind it. Lena had spent hours poring over ancient texts, studying every ritual and incantation she could find. The answers had been hard to come by, fragments of lost knowledge hidden deep in the town's archives, pieced together from scraps of forgotten lore. But she had found a way, an ancient binding ritual that could sever the ocean's hold on Samuel Graves. It was dangerous, risky, and no one had attempted it in centuries. But Lena wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The ritual required a combination of artifacts, items that had been carefully chosen for their connection to both the ocean and the land. She had gathered them all, each piece an integral part of the ceremony. The first was a shard of obsidian, a volcanic rock formed in the fires of the earth. It symbolized the land's strength, its resilience. The second was a vial of salt water from the deepest part of the ocean, taken from a place where the currents were the strongest. This was the ocean's essence, its soul. The third artifact was an old, rusted lantern, the same lantern Samuel Graves had once used to light the way for ships. It represented his light, his duty, and the man he had once been. And the final item, the most crucial of them all, was the bone of a whale, an ancient relic passed down through generations of fishermen in Raven's End. It was said to contain the power of the ocean itself, a fragment of the beast that ruled the deep. With these items, Lena would bind the ocean's power, weakening it enough to sever its connection to Samuel. She had spent days preparing for this moment, and now, she stood on the brink, ready to face the storm that awaited her. Elias stood beside her, his expression grim. The historian had been invaluable in helping her understand the rituals and the history behind them. He had dug deep into the town's past, uncovering lost records and forgotten stories that would guide them in this final act. He was not an active participant in the ritual. He had no wish to be, but his knowledge was essential. He had helped Lena understand the ocean's true nature, and he would be there to support her, even if only from a distance. "I'm not going to lie to you," Elias said, his voice low. "This won't be easy. The ocean is not something you can control, and if it feels threatened, it will fight back with everything it has." "I know," Lena replied, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her. "But I don't have a choice. I can't leave it like this. I have to try." Elias nodded, though his eyes betrayed his concern. "Just be careful. The Hollow Man, Samuel, he's not the only one affected by this. The ocean, it's ancient and it's angry." Lena took a deep breath and turned her gaze back to the churning water below. The storm clouds had gathered once more, thick and foreboding, just as the ancient texts had warned. The ocean had sensed her presence, and it was already preparing to fight back. But Lena couldn't turn away now. She was too close to the truth, too close to freeing Samuel from the curse that had bound him for so long. With the artifacts in hand, Lena moved to the center of the ritual circle she had drawn earlier. The circle was etched into the stone with obsidian and salt, the lines glowing faintly in the dim light. The ritual would take place here, where the ocean's power was strongest, where the land met the water. The circle would act as a barrier, holding the ocean at bay long enough for Lena to perform the ritual and sever the connection between Samuel and the sea. She placed the artifacts in the center of the circle, one by one, and began to chant the incantation she had memorized. The words were ancient, their meanings lost to time, but she could feel the power in them, each syllable vibrating with the strength of the earth and the ocean. The wind began to pick up, whipping around her, as though the very air itself was reacting to the ritual. She focused, her heart steady, her mind clear. The first few words of the incantation seemed to hold no power. The air remained still, the storm barely noticeable in the distance. But as she continued, the wind began to howl louder, the waves crashing against the rocks below. It was as if the ocean was awakening, feeling the power of the ritual. Lena's voice grew louder, stronger, as she called upon the forces of land and sea to join together, to break the curse that had bound Samuel for so long. Suddenly, the ocean roared, a deafening sound that seemed to shake the very earth beneath her feet. The water surged forward, crashing against the cliffs with such force that it sent spray into the air, drenching Lena and Elias. The storm was upon them now, and the ocean's fury was unleashed. Lena's heart raced as the power of the ocean pressed against her, fighting to break the circle and end the ritual. She could feel the cold, ancient force of the sea pushing against her, testing her resolve. The wind howled like a living thing, tugging at her clothes, pushing her back, but she held her ground, continuing the chant, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. Elias shouted something, but Lena couldn't hear him over the roar of the storm. The ocean was in a frenzy now, the waves rising higher, crashing against the rocks with such force that it felt as though the very earth would split apart. The storm was not just a physical force. It was alive, angry, and it would stop at nothing to prevent Lena from completing the ritual. And then, amidst the storm's rage, Lena heard something else. A voice, faint but clear, carried on the wind. It was a whisper, a mournful cry, and it came from the ocean itself. No. It whispered, "You cannot bind me. I am eternal. You cannot break me." The ocean's voice was cold and full of malice, but Lena didn't flinch. She had come too far to back down now. She focused on the words, pushing through the storm's fury. The ocean might be eternal, but it was not invincible. And with this ritual, she would prove it. The ritual had begun, and there would be no turning back now. The storm was relentless. The wind howled, pushing at Lena with all the fury of the ocean itself. The waves, once distant and manageable, had grown monstrous, crashing against the jagged rocks below with a force that shook the very ground beneath her feet. The ritual circle that had once felt like a protective barrier now seemed like a fragile, almost laughable boundary against the raw power of nature. The sky above was black, a wall of storm clouds that blotted out the stars. Lightning crackled in the distance, followed by deafening rolls of thunder. The ocean, too, seemed to roar with rage, as though it knew that Lena was trying to bind it, that she was attempting to break its grip on Samuel Graves. And it was fighting back with everything it had. Lena fought to keep her focus, her voice barely audible over the tumult. The words of the incantation poured from her lips, but the storm drowned them out, the power of the ritual struggling to take root in the chaos. The elements had turned against her, the wind sharp as knives, the rain like 1,000 stinging needles. It was as though the ocean itself was trying to claw its way into her soul, to tear apart her resolve and swallow her whole. Her hands trembled as she clutched the artifacts that lay in the center of the ritual circle. The whale bone, the obsidian shard, the saltwater vial, and the lantern. They all pulsed with energy, but it wasn't enough. The ocean fought against them, each wave stronger than the last, each gust of wind pushing harder against her. She was losing ground. The hollow man appeared then, stepping out of the mist, his figure a dark silhouette against the storm's fury. His movements were slow, hesitant, as though he were torn between two forces, the call of the ocean and his duty to Lena. His face was obscured by the shadows, as it always was, but his eyes were visible now, wide and filled with conflict. Lena's heart skipped a beat as she saw him. He was the last thing she wanted to be distracted by, but she couldn't help it. The hollow man, Samuel Graves, was here, and for the first time, she saw not just a monster, but a man lost between two worlds. He stood at the edge of the ritual circle, his posture stiff, as if unsure of what to do. The ocean's call was strong, but something in his eyes told her he wasn't beyond redemption. He turned his head toward her, his voice a low, tortured whisper that barely cut through the sound of the storm. "Lena," he said, his voice strained, "you have to stop. The ocean won't let you do this. It's too powerful. It will destroy us both." Lena's heart clenched as she looked at him, the man who had been cursed, who had been twisted into something unrecognizable. But she could see the truth now. The hollow man was not just a monster. He was a victim. He had been consumed by the ocean, forced to do its bidding for eternity. And now, he was caught in the crossfire of her ritual. "No," Lena said, her voice firm despite the fear in her chest. "I won't stop. I have to finish this. I can't let it control you any longer." The hollow man's shoulders slumped, as though the weight of his existence were too much to bear. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out to her as if in a plea, but the ocean's roar drowned out any further words. His figure wavered, caught between two worlds, between the curse and the chance for freedom. Lena's heart broke for him, but she couldn't let him stop her now, not when she was so close. Suddenly, a burst of light illuminated the storm, followed by a blinding flash of lightning. The ocean seemed to scream in defiance, and for a moment, Lena thought she might be swept away. But then, in the split second that followed, Elias's voice cut through the noise. "Lena, now." Lena turned just in time to see Elias, standing outside the circle, his face pale with fear and determination. He was holding something, an object that Lena couldn't quite make out, but his expression told her all she needed to know. He was ready to help, even if it meant sacrificing everything. "Elias, no!" Lena screamed, but it was too late. In one swift motion, Elias threw the object, a small, carved totem, into the center of the ritual circle. The moment it made contact with the artifacts, the ocean seemed to recoil, as if struck by an invisible force. The storm intensified, the winds howling louder, the waves surging higher. The ritual was nearing its completion, but the ocean was not going to give up without a fight. And then, just as Lena felt the last surge of power pulse through her, the storm seemed to explode. A gust of wind knocked her to the ground, and the sea roared in its final act of defiance. Lightning struck the rocks nearby, sending a shower of sparks into the air, and for a moment, Lena thought the world was coming to an end. But then, through the chaos, she felt a shift, a sudden, overwhelming calm. The storm receded, the winds died down, and the ocean's furious roar faded into the distance. The ritual was complete. The binding had worked. Lena collapsed onto the ground, her breath ragged, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had done it. The Hollow Man was free, and the curse was broken. But as she looked up, her eyes widening in horror, she saw that Elias was not moving. "No!" she whispered, rushing to his side. Elias was lying motionless on the ground, his eyes wide open, his face frozen in an expression of pure pain. The totem, still in his hand, had triggered the final phase of the ritual, but at a cost. Elias had given his life to save her, to ensure that the ritual succeeded. Lena's heart shattered as she knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she tried to shake him awake. But it was no use. Elias was gone. The Hollow Man, now standing at the edge of the circle, looked down at her with eyes full of sorrow. He had been freed from the ocean's grip, but the cost had been too high. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice full of regret. "I couldn't stop him." Lena didn't respond. She was too numb, too lost in the pain of what had just happened. She had saved Samuel, but in doing so, she had lost someone who had helped her when no one else would. And so, as the storm cleared and the ocean fell silent, Lena was left standing alone in the wreckage of the ritual, the echoes of the Hollow Man's sorrowful whispers filling the air. The storm's remnants lingered in the air, a heavy, suffocating presence. The wind, no longer howling with the fury of the ocean, had slowed to a mere whisper. The clouds above, once dark and ominous, had begun to break, allowing streaks of moonlight to pierce the night sky. But even with the storm fading, the weight of what had just transpired hung heavy in the air. Lena stood in the midst of the wreckage, still reeling from Elias's sacrifice, her breath shallow and unsteady. Her hands, trembling with exhaustion and grief, were pressed against the cold ground. She could still hear the Hollow Man's whispers, the sound of the ocean's last desperate cry. The power of the ritual had weakened the ocean's hold on Samuel Graves, freeing him from the curse, but it had come at a devastating cost. The Hollow Man stood nearby, his figure no longer as obscured by shadows as it once was. The transformation was slow, almost painful to watch. His form flickered like a fading candle, his body shifting between the monstrous silhouette of the Hollow Man and the human shape of Samuel Graves. For a brief moment, Lena could see his face clearly, the once maddened eyes now filled with clarity, a trace of humanity returning to his expression. The ocean had lost its grip on him, but it wasn't going down without a fight. Lena took a tentative step forward, unsure of what to expect. Samuel, no longer the Hollow Man, but not fully human yet, turned toward her, his eyes locking with hers. There was a quiet understanding between them now, an unspoken bond forged by their shared pain, the curse that had bound them both for so long. I can feel it," Samuel said, his voice hoarse, like a man who had been locked in silence for too long. "The ocean's grip, it's slipping away. I remember who I was. I remember you." Lena's heart raced as she took another step toward him, her eyes filled with both hope and sorrow. "You're free," she whispered, her voice trembling. You're free from it. Samuel's lips twitched, a half-smile forming on his face as he reached out toward her. But before he could speak, the ground trembled beneath their feet, and a deafening roar from the ocean shattered the fragile moment. The air shifted, thickening with an overwhelming sense of dread. The ocean wasn't done with them. Far from it. A monstrous wave, larger than any Lena had ever seen, surged from the depths of the sea. It rose from the horizon like a living creature, a wall of water that seemed to pulse with anger. The moonlight reflected off its surface, casting it in an eerie, ghostly glow. It was as if the ocean itself had become a creature of vengeance, determined to reclaim what it had lost. "No," Lena gasped, her voice choked with fear. She turned to Samuel, her hands grabbing onto his arm. "We need to move now." Samuel didn't hesitate. The transformation was still incomplete, but his newfound humanity drove him forward. With a strength that felt human, yet tinged with the power of the curse that had once bound him, he pulled Lena with him, running toward the cliffs. The wave was closing in, a massive, churning wall of water that threatened to swallow everything in its path. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she ran, her feet stumbling on the slick, rain-soaked ground. The roar of the wave grew louder, drowning out everything else. She could see the shore, the jagged cliffs ahead, her only chance of survival. But even as she ran, she could feel the pull of the ocean, as if it was calling to her, dragging her toward the wave. Just as the wave crashed against the cliffs, the force of it nearly throwing them off their feet, Samuel pulled Lena into a narrow cave hidden beneath the rocks. The wave roared just feet away from them, its fury crashing against the cliffs with a deafening crash. The water surged past the entrance to the cave, but they were safe, for the moment. Lena collapsed against the cave's damp stone walls, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Samuel, too, was panting, his face drawn with exhaustion. The wave had nearly claimed them both, but they had escaped, just barely. "Is it over?" Lena asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Samuel stood silently for a moment, staring out at the storm's remnants. "I don't know, but it's not finished yet." Lena felt a knot form in her stomach, the weight of his words sinking in. She had broken the curse, freed him from the Hollow Man, but the ocean, was it truly done with them? Was it ever going to let them go? As the storm continued to recede, the moonlight began to filter in through the cracks in the cave, casting soft shadows against the walls. Samuel's eyes locked with hers again, and for the first time since their first meeting, Lena saw something entirely new in him. Regret, yes, but also hope. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft but full of meaning. "You gave me back what I thought was lost forever." Lena's heart swelled with empathy as she reached out, her hand resting on his arm. "We did this together." He nodded slowly, his face softening. The man he once was emerging from the depths of his suffering. But even as the cave grew quieter, even as the storm outside calmed, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that the ocean wasn't finished with them. The Hollow Man was gone, but the curse, it might still linger, like a shadow in the deep. And in that moment, Lena knew that their battle was far from over. The lighthouse stood at the edge of the world, where land met the endless sea. Once a symbol of hope for sailors, it had now become a tombstone marking the boundary between the living and the cursed. Lena and Samuel stood before it, the wind whipping around them, pulling at their clothes as if the very ocean was trying to drag them back into its depths. Lena's heart was heavy with the weight of what they were about to attempt. This was the final step, the one that would sever the ocean's hold on Raven's End and, hopefully, free both her and Samuel from the nightmare that had defined their lives for far too long. She had learned so much during her time here. The truth about the Hollow Man, the rituals, the ancient power that had bound this town and its people. Now, she would finish what she had started, or die trying. Samuel stood beside her, his once terrifying presence now tempered by the flicker of humanity that still clung to him. His transformation was nearly complete. He no longer flickered between forms, but there was still a darkness within him, a lingering trace of the Hollow Man's influence. She could see it in his eyes, the storm still raging beneath the surface. "This is it," Lena said, her voice firm, though her hands trembled with a mix of fear and resolve. "Once we do this, there's no going back." Samuel nodded, his expression somber. "I know, but this is the only way to make sure the ocean never controls us again." Together, they climbed the weathered steps of the lighthouse, each footfall echoing in the silence that surrounded them. The storm clouds were beginning to gather again on the horizon, a reminder that the ocean was not going to let them succeed without a fight. But Lena was determined. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. Inside the lighthouse, the air was thick with the smell of salt and decay. The walls, once adorned with maps and charts, were now nothing more than the remnants of a forgotten past. The altar where she had discovered the remnants of the old rituals stood at the center of the room, still covered in offerings and symbols of the ocean's power. It was here, Lena knew, that the final ritual would take place. They had gathered everything they needed, the artifacts, the incantations, the ancient symbols that had been passed down through the generations. The power of the ocean, she had learned, was bound to the lighthouse, to the place where the land met the sea. And it was here that the final binding would occur. Samuel's hand brushed hers as they approached the altar, a touch that was both comforting and unsettling. He was no longer the hollow man, but the bond between them, forged through their shared suffering, remained. It was a bond that would either save them or destroy them. "We need to begin," Lena said, her voice steady as she placed the final artifact on the altar, a shard of stone, worn smooth by centuries of contact with the ocean. Samuel nodded, stepping back to give her space. "I'll stand guard. The ocean won't let this happen easily." Lena closed her eyes, focusing on the incantations she had learned. The words were ancient, their meaning long lost to time, but she could feel their power, the surge of energy that began to hum through the air as she spoke them aloud. The air around her thickened, heavy with the weight of the ritual. At first, nothing happened, but then, the ground beneath their feet trembled, and the wind outside began to pick up once more. The ocean's fury was stirring, its power rising in response to the ritual's energy. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she chanted louder, her voice growing stronger. The ocean was listening, reacting to her words, to the binding that would cut its ties to Raven's End. The storm outside intensified, waves crashing against the cliffs with a deafening roar, as if the sea itself was protesting the ritual. The lighthouse shuddered, the ancient stone groaning under the pressure of the ocean's wrath. It was as if the very foundations of the world were being ripped apart. Suddenly, a voice, a low, guttural growl, echoed from the depths of the ocean, reverberating through the walls of the lighthouse. It was the hollow man's voice, but distorted, twisted by the ocean's power. "No," the voice roared. "You cannot break the bond. I will not let you." Lena's hands shook, but she did not falter. She had come too far to back down now. The ritual had to be completed, no matter the cost. The storm outside raged, lightning flashing across the sky, striking the lighthouse with violent force. The ocean's fury had reached its peak, and it was determined to destroy everything in its path. Lena's voice wavered, but she pressed on. She had to finish this. For herself, for Samuel, for the people of Raven's End. But as she reached the final words of the ritual, the ocean made its final, desperate move. A massive wave, larger than any before, rose up from the sea, crashing toward the lighthouse with terrifying speed. The force of it shook the building, and for a moment, Lena thought the lighthouse itself would crumble under the weight of the ocean's fury. "No!" she screamed, but it was too late. The wave hit with the force of 1,000 storms, and the lighthouse seemed to explode in a flash of blinding light. Lena was thrown from her feet, her body slamming against the cold, stone floor. The ritual had not been completed. The ocean had struck back, and now they were caught in its final, vengeful grasp. The chapter ends as the lighthouse shatters, the ocean's wrath closing in around Lena and Samuel. The light fades, leaving only darkness and the deafening roar of the sea. The storm reached its apex, the very earth beneath Lena and Samuel trembling under the wrath of the ocean. The lighthouse, once a silent sentinel against the waves, now groaned with the force of nature's fury. The sea had risen like a beast, its waves crashing against the cliffs with an unnatural force, as if the ocean itself was fighting to keep its grip on Raven's End on them. But Lena's focus never wavered. She had to finish the ritual, had to sever the ocean's connection to the town and to Samuel once and for all. Her voice rang through the air, ancient words echoing in the chamber, intertwining with the crackling energy that now filled the space. It was as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the final moment. Beside her, Samuel stood tall, his form flickering between his human self and the shadowed figure of the hollow man. He watched her, his eyes filled with a sorrowful understanding, knowing this would be their last chance. His hands clenched at his sides, muscles tense, but he said nothing. He did not need to. He had already made his peace with what had to be done. Lena's voice grew louder, more forceful, as she invoked the last words of the ritual. The stones around them seemed to hum with energy, their power amplifying as the storm intensified. The ritual's completion was within reach. But just as she uttered the final incantation, the world erupted. The lighthouse, already unstable from the raging storm, seemed to crack open like an egg. The air shimmered with raw, unbridled power as the ocean responded to the ritual with one last desperate attack. A deafening roar filled the room as the sea's fury surged toward them. Waves crashed through the shattered windows, water flooding into the lighthouse at a horrifying speed. The force of the ocean's retaliation was unlike anything Lena had ever felt. It was as though the very sea had come alive, determined to drag them back into its depths. The ground beneath their feet trembled violently, the walls cracking and splintering. The ritual had succeeded. She could feel it in her bones. But the ocean would not let them leave without extracting its final toll. Lena and Samuel had no time to react before the lighthouse seemed to collapse in on itself. The roof tore away, and the walls crumbled, leaving only chaos in its wake. The foundation of the lighthouse groaned and split, sending massive chunks of stone tumbling into the churning sea below. It was as if the ocean itself had reached into the heart of the lighthouse and torn it apart, unwilling to relinquish its hold. With no warning, the room began to disintegrate around them. The altar, the sacred space where the ritual had taken place, was now nothing more than a shattered heap of debris, swallowed by the rising tide. The waves surged higher, flooding the room with freezing water, crashing against Lena's chest as she tried to hold herself steady. Samuel's arm shot out, grabbing her just as the floor beneath them buckled. He pulled her toward him, his strength no longer the hollow, ghostly force it once was, but human and solid. "We have to go," he growled, his voice sharp with urgency. Lena nodded, struggling to keep her footing as the ocean's wrath poured into the lighthouse. The door was already gone, replaced by a wall of water that surged toward them like an unstoppable beast. They turned and ran, scrambling up the stairs that had not yet collapsed, water rising fast behind them. Every step felt like an eternity as the roar of the ocean grew louder, its fury now all-consuming. The very walls of the lighthouse groaned as though they, too, were alive, fighting to survive against the tidal force trying to tear them down. The air was thick with the smell of salt water and desperation, and Lena's heart hammered in her chest. The hollow man, Samuel, moved with purpose, pulling her toward the narrow door that led to the top of the lighthouse, where the winds were violent, the world spinning like a vortex around them. They reached the top just as the lighthouse began to collapse entirely. Samuel was already ahead of her, his hand outstretched to help her through the final opening. The moment her hand touched his, the ground beneath them cracked, sending stones tumbling into the abyss below. "Hold on," Samuel shouted, pulling her up through the opening, just as the lighthouse behind them gave way entirely. The storm, the ocean's wrath, the very world seemed to tear itself apart. With a final, spine-chilling crack, the lighthouse crumbled, its remnants swept away by the ocean's unforgiving power. But Lena and Samuel were free. They stood on the edge of the cliffs, breathless, watching as the lighthouse disappeared beneath the violent waves. The storm raged around them, but for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, The curse was finally broken. The Hollow Man was no more. Samuel collapsed to his knees, his form flickering one last time, before stabilizing into his human self. His face was worn, but there was peace in his eyes, a peace Lena had never seen before. "It's over," he whispered, his voice hoarse, yet filled with relief. "It's over." Lena stood beside him, her heart still racing, but now filled with a bittersweet sense of closure. She looked back at the now-ruined lighthouse, watching as the ocean's waves slowly began to recede, their fury finally spent. The curse was broken, but the cost had been high. The town of Raven's End, its secrets, its pain, had all been swept away with the ruins of the lighthouse. The Hollow Man, the ocean's puppet, was now free. His suffering finally ended. The journey away from Raven's End was silent. The storm had passed, but the weight of the past still lingered, like a fog clinging to the hills. Lena sat beside Samuel in the car, her gaze fixed on the road ahead, her thoughts scattered between what they had left behind and what lay ahead. She didn't know where they were going, didn't know if there was a place where they could truly escape the memories that haunted them. But one thing was clear. They couldn't stay in Raven's End, not after everything that had happened. Samuel, now fully human again, stared out of the window, his expression distant. The transformation had been difficult for him, a transition between two worlds. The Hollow Man was gone, but the person he had once been, the man he had been before the pact with the ocean, was still buried beneath the layers of time and tragedy. He was struggling to find his place in this world, a world that had moved on without him. His mind was in turmoil, his once familiar sense of self shattered by his long years of torment. He didn't know how to be human again. Lena glanced at him, watching the way his hands gripped the door handle, as if it was the only thing tethering him to the present. The memories of his transformation, of his existence as the Hollow Man, were still raw in his mind. She could see it in his eyes, the struggle to reconcile the monster he had become with the man he had once been. He had been freed from the curse, but the ocean had left a mark on him that no amount of time could erase. She reached out to him, her fingers brushing against his arm. He flinched, but then turned to meet her gaze. "You'll find your way," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of everything they had endured. "You're free. You just need time." Samuel didn't respond immediately, but there was a flicker of something, an acknowledgement in his eyes. Slowly, he nodded, but the distance between them remained, like an invisible barrier built by years of suffering. He wasn't ready to let go of his past, not yet, and Lena, though she had fought alongside him, didn't know how to heal the parts of him that had been broken long before she arrived. The drive was long and aimless, each mile taking them farther from Raven's End and the horrors that had once defined their lives. The town was a distant memory now, a place swallowed by the ocean's fury, but the curse, the whispers, they would never truly leave. Not entirely. Days passed, and life began to return to a semblance of normalcy for Lena, but the trauma lingered. She found herself waking in the night, her skin damp with sweat, the sound of waves crashing in her ears. The ocean was always there, somewhere in the background, whispering its ancient song. Even in the quietest moments, she could feel its presence, like a shadow that refused to fade. Samuel, too, was struggling. He couldn't find peace. His attempts to fit back into a world that had long forgotten him felt futile. He wandered through their temporary apartment like a ghost, his hands trembling as he tried to reacquaint himself with simple human tasks. His past had been erased, but the scars it left on his soul were not. He would never truly be the man he once was, not entirely. And Lena, despite her attempts to comfort him, felt the distance between them growing. She was fighting her own battle, one that had nothing to do with Samuel and everything to do with the ocean. She couldn't escape it, not even now. Far from Raven's End, she could still hear the whispers, like a constant hum beneath the surface of her thoughts. Her sister, Emily, had always been a part of this. Lena's journey had started with Emily's disappearance, and it had only ended when the curse was broken, or so she thought. The haunting memories, the terrifying truth about Raven's End, they had all led her to this point. But now that it was over, She didn't know how to move on. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the apartment, Lena sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. The silence in the room was palpable, broken only by the sound of Samuel pacing in the other room. She was about to close her eyes and escape into sleep when a knock at the door broke the stillness. Her heart raced as she opened it, expecting something, anything, but nothing prepared her for what was in front of her. A small package, wrapped in brown paper, sat on the doorstep. No return address, no sign of who had left it. Just the package, as if it had appeared out of thin air. Lena's pulse quickened. She bent down to retrieve it, her fingers trembling as she brought the package inside. Her name was written on the label, scrawled in familiar handwriting. She tore it open, and inside, she found a familiar object, a necklace, tarnished with age, the same one Emily had worn. And beneath the necklace, a note. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she read the words, "The ocean never forgets." A chill ran down her spine. Her fingers clutched the note, the words echoing in her mind, over and over again. The ocean, the curse, Raven's End. It wasn't over. Not completely. She turned slowly to Samuel, who had entered the room, drawn by the sound of the package's arrival. He saw the look on her face, the fear creeping into her eyes, and he knew instantly. The battle was not over. Not yet. The chapter ends with Lena staring at the necklace in her hand, the weight of the ocean's past still pressing down on her shoulders. The whispers that had followed her from Raven's End were not gone, and they were not done with her yet. The ocean had remembered, and so had she. The fight was far from over.